Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first and hopefully not last episode of uh, ARO Composition Song Explained by the guy who wrote the song named Andrew Oliver. That is the official title, and it will not be changing. Um, I made that video that was like 2 hours long that was explaining all the changes I made to my song Endless Nights. And I really liked that video. I think I did a good job explaining things. I think it's very long and not everyone's going to want to watch it, which is completely fair, but it was fun to make. And I want to make more videos like that. The problem is, while I do want to update more of my songs, it's a bit challenging and it takes a lot of thought. Whereas some of these songs, like this song "Her" that I'm about to talk about, I wrote this in an hour. So like I it just takes less time, and so it's easier for me to do. Um, Also, it's late at night, and I just got home for fall break, so this is like very gonna be very probably very chill and laid back. And my words are not gonna work quite the same, but that's okay. Just think of this as like a sort of a chill podcast or something. Um, but anyway, with my more recent songs, I feel like there's also stuff I can talk about. Because what I liked with the video I made about Endless Nights at Sea is I got to kind of explain my thought process behind why I did certain things and talk about like some of the chords and all those sorts of things. And so I want to be able to explain why I wrote the things I wrote, even for the newer songs. But for the newer songs, I can't do that by making a video, improving the song because I literally just wrote it. And so I'm not that interested in trying to improve it because there's not much that needs to be fixed. I wrote it the way I wanted it to be written and now it's done. So I figured I'd start this little series. Hopefully, it'll be a series, and some of them will probably be really short. I might not always have a lot to say, but I'll just kind of, whenever I write a new song, I'll explain what's going on, explain my thought processes, talk about some of the chord progressions and things like that in a way that will hopefully give you some insight into my own brain, as well as potentially, depending on how much you know, teach you a little bit about music theory. And I'm hoping to set this up in a way that will not feel too boring or remedial to those who do know music theory, but will also not be too difficult to grasp for those that don't. Um, so there's a chance I might explain a little bit of the basics of music stuff in each of these. I don't know. But let's just go ahead and get into this. I added some various things. So first of all, with basically any song I write, you can go and check practically every song I've written. I almost always start by establishing some sort of chord progression before I bring in a melody. I like to do that because I love chords and I love chord progressions, and so I always love starting with that because it's a lot of fun, and I feel like it sounds cool. Um, and also it's a good way to kind of ease your way into the song before the melody comes in instead of it all just starting right at once. Of course, I think it depends on the song, but that's often how I like to do it, and that is exactly what I do here. So right off the bat, I am establishing the key of this song with this minor one chord. So basically, if you look at this key could either be A major or F sharp minor. And if we look at the notes, we have a C sharp, an F sharp, and an A, which is the three notes of an F sharp minor chord: F sharp, A, and C sharp. Now, because the C sharp is on the bottom, even though the F sharp is what's known as the root, um, let me better explain this. So, like, this is an F sharp major chord. Because the name is F sharp major, or minor, sorry, that means that F sharp is what's known as the root of the chord. However, the lowest note of the chord is called the bass note, and the bass note doesn't have to be the root. So in this case, the bass note is a C sharp, which is the top note of the chord. And because it's on the bottom, that's what's called a second inversion. So it starts with the minor 1 chord to quickly establish the key we're in. It also starts very quiet, and then it crescendos as it goes. The next chord is the major 7 chord, which always honestly throws me off when I do this Roman numeral analysis in a minor key, because in a major key the 7 chord is diminished, and diminished chords are really weird. And if there's not a diminished chord in here, so I'm not going to worry about explaining what a diminished chord is, but they're kind of funky, and so it's strange to me that it's major in a minor key. But it makes sense because of how keys work. Especially when you think about how if it was a major key, that would be the 5 chord. But anyway, so then you go from the 1 to the 7. All of this is staying within the key. The 7 builds up into the 3, which is also major, and this is the loudest point of this chord progression because it gets up to mezzo piano before it then starts decrescendoing on the next one. On the final chord of the progression before it repeats, you have your minor 4 chord, and this is when the cello is preparing to come in with a bit of, I don't know if I'd quite call it a melody, but it's got some moving notes to start setting some things up. And so to prepare it to come in, I talked about this if you watched my Endless Nights at Sea video, but this is what is known as voice leading, which is where I want the cellos here. This is where they really come in, but to ease into things, I have them start a measure. I am thinking of the right word. I have them start a measure earlier, and then the cellos start quiet and they crescendo into the point where they're actually coming in. So this part isn't as important, and it's quieter than the other notes, but that kind of eases it in. I think the wording I used is that in the other videos the cellos are kind of sneaking in. But what's also interesting about this is you've got this stepwise motion here where it goes from the F sharp to the G, or to the G sharp. And because of that, because this is a minor 4 chord, which would be, this is weird. Is this minor? This isn't, hold on. Give me a second. I think I did something wrong. I know what I did wrong. Let me double check. Actually, I might be totally fine. I'm just tired. No, I did this wrong. I put this as a 4 instead of a 6. I can't. Can you believe that? How embarrassing. Let me go ahead and fix that real quick. I could pause the recording. However, why would I do that when you can watch me do this and I can waste your time? And by that I mean whatever. I'm just don't feel like it. But you can see, you'll notice I do all of this stuff by hand, which is, it's kind of funny. I've had quite a few people be like, dude, I can't believe you write music by hand. And it makes it sound like I have a quill and parchment and I'm notating it out and whatever. But I just click around on MuseScore. It's not that crazy. But they're just impressed that I don't use a MIDI keyboard. But I don't like MIDI keyboards, honestly. I can see how for beat making type of stuff, I can see how it could be helpful for that. But personally, for notating, I just find it to be easier to do everything by clicking. But that's just a random thought. Back to this. So with this stepwise motion, you've got your minor 4 chord, which is B minor, and so that's B, D, F sharp. So the cello starts with a D, which is in the chord, because I said it's B, D, and F sharp, and so the D is in there. Which, by the way, when a chord, the most basic kind of chord is what I've been talking about that has 3 notes. It's called a triad. So that's part of the triad. But then this not a D, it's an F sharp. I was thinking in treble clef for a second. F sharp. It goes to this G sharp. But the G sharp is not part of that triad. It's one step above the top note of the chord, which is the F sharp. So this is a G sharp, which means it is the sixth of the chord, which means there's some dissonance there where you've got this F sharp and you've got this G sharp. And so because of how close together they are, the notes sound a little weird together. So the sixth adds some dissonance in there, which is cool. And there's a lot of little moments like that. So then this chord progression repeats, but now the cello has some moving notes. This is to provide some motion so that it feels like the song is going somewhere. It like develops the song, but I didn't want to bring the main melody in yet. I kind of you'll see like this is really, which also you might hear my dog throughout this video, but that's okay. But like right here, this is where it gets louder than the whole intro, and this is 17 measures in, so there's a 16 measure intro, which is fairly long, especially in a slow song like this. That's almost a minute. And so finally, Otis, please don't scratch on the door. I'm trying to record. This guy. So finally, after like a minute, you get to an actual like real melody, and that's done intentionally because it's like you're almost there. You're just waiting and waiting for that melody to finally come in. It's like, okay, there's chords and stuff's happening, but where is this going? It leaves you in suspense. That's the word I was looking for. It leaves you in suspense because this has some moving notes, and you're like, oh, could this be a melody? But it's not really interesting enough to be a melody, I would say. And then finally, it gets louder than it's been at any point in the song before that, and that melody comes in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So it restarts the chord progression. The chord progression is almost exactly the same. Some little things thrown in here. This cello's moving part. This note right here is the seventh of the chord, which means it doesn't fit in the triad. Then this continues like usual. There's no crescendo here. This is one thing that I sometimes like to do that I find interesting in songs is the dynamic doesn't change in the cello part, which means that right here, even though the cello is essentially the main focus of this portion, because it's the only part that's moving and it's the only part that really changes from before, the cello here is now at the exact same dynamic as all the other instruments. Which means that it's not going to stand in as much. It's going to sort of blend in there until they start decrescendoing again. Now, realistically, if this is performed live, most conductors would probably advise them to still play a little bit louder. But I think it's an interesting effect to sort of have... I think I do this in some of my other songs. I just can't think of specific examples. But it's kind of interesting to have a melody that's very pronounced, and then there's just like little moments where everything else builds to where the melody sort of blends in and it almost disappears inside of everything else until everything else goes back down and it kind of re-emerges. I think that's a cool effect. There's some songs that I really like that do that. I think the song is called Liquidation Total by Loose Fur. I love that whole album. But that song, there's like this part that just repeats for a lot of the song. But it kind of takes a while for it to actually, like, it slowly builds up in like volume until you hear it. And it emerges from the rest of the instrumental, if I'm thinking of the right song. And I just think that's like a really cool effect. Anyway, so then this third chord, these two notes that like blend in with everything else, are the sixth and the fourth, so neither of them fit in the triad, which makes this whole measure pretty funky. And then here we're back to the minor one chord, except that we've got this B in here, so it's F sharp, A, C sharp, but you've got this B, which is right in between the A and the C sharp, which means you've got it adds the fourth. which is an interesting effect. And so then everything starts decrescendoing just like before, except now the violin is crescendoing and it becomes sort of the main focus. But what you'll notice here is the violin, while it does have something new going on, it is at the same dynamic level as the cello. So while I say it's the main focus, and I do think that's accurate because it is the newest part, which makes it the most interesting. Technically, it is sort of combined with the cello to make the main focus of the song. Also, what I did here is because the violin one was previously playing part of the chord, which is pretty important, now the bass, which wasn't playing before, is playing part of the chord. So I sometimes like to temporarily, I like to put the bass in a little bit later in the beginning, so that way it starts with like a higher, lighter sound, and then eventually the bass and like that lower stuff comes in to sort of ground things. So it's a very similar thing to before, because it's the same chord progression, but now the differences are coming from this new part in the first violin. So this is the sixth of the chord, and then you've got the seventh here again. But then here it goes from the sixth to, let's see, that's an A, so that would be the third, which is in the chord. So that sixth is gone, that dissonance disappears. Then you've got your major seven chord, but then it goes down to a sixth right here. You've got your same progression with this F sharp being the sixth, whereas here it's the fourth. Here I had some trouble figuring out what in the world was going on in this chord, because this note moves up to an A. So the most accurate thing I could figure out is I think this is a major 3 chord with an added 7th and 11th. So if we look at this, we have A, we have E, we have D, and we have G. That on its own doesn't make like a logical chord. So here is how I came to this conclusion. The first thing you want to do when you've got something weird like this is figure out what chords you could make and what makes the most sense in this context. So essentially, when the most basic chord is a triad, as I said, so you want to figure out what triads you can make. But sometimes when other like dissonant notes are added, like if it's a 7th chord or they add a 9th or something like that, sometimes composers will remove the 3rd from a chord. So in this case, we have this major 3 chord would be A major, which is A, C sharp, E. So C sharp is the 3rd. So because we're adding the 7 and 11, we could remove that C sharp. We could remove the 3rd, and that causes things to be a little less muddy. It kind of takes away some of the dissonance, while still giving you the main structure of the chords. Now, technically, because that 3rd is gone, it could be a minor chord. If that C sharp was actually a C natural, it would be A minor. So because we don't have the 3rd to tell us if it's a C natural or C sharp, this could be a minor 3rd with an added 7 and 11. But given the context, because it's following up this major 3 chord, it's probably still a major 3. And then in A, C sharp, E, then G would be the 7th, D would be the 11th. And that is how I came to the conclusion that this was the chord. Now, an alternative possible way of looking at it is you have your G and your D. That could be, or your G sharp and your D. that could be if it was G sharp B D, and then you take out the third. It could be a G sharp diminished chord, um, which would be the two chord in this key. However, diminished chords are weird, and so it doesn't make as much sense, especially since it's following up this major three. So going from a major three to another major three makes way more sense, like contextually, and also seventh and 11th are both like very commonly used in a chord. Well, I guess the 11th is not as common as the 7th, but essentially, odd numbers are very common because a triad consists of the root, which is the 1, the third, which obviously is 3, and then the fifth. And so 1, 3, and 5 are all odd numbers, and then you keep going, you've got 7, 9, 11, 13. Those are like kind of the most common ones, and then sometimes you'll get an add 4 or an add 6 or something like that. But the odd numbers tend to be more common, and so it is more likely that that's what it is. And the thing with music theory is everyone views things differently, so you could equally make the argument that it is a G sharp diminished chord, and you wouldn't be wrong. Some people just wouldn't view it the same way as you. Like, technically, you can view it however you want. It's just about context. And so, if it was that G sharp, that minor chord, then the other two notes are the E and the A. Which would be the second, and the A would be the second, and the E would be the sixth. And so, while it is possible, like I said, odd numbers are a lot more common. So, just logically, this makes a lot more sense for what this chord is. Which I realize a lot of this is just going to be talking about chords because I love chords. But, you know, I talk about a variety of things. But especially with this song specifically, this is very focused on chords. Because it's just meant to be like a slow, pretty song with kind of like a movie soundtrack vibe. And that's all about chords, baby. Which is exactly what I want. So then we got the 1 add 4 again. And then this is where it's working on transitioning into the point where it finally has like a real main melody. So the first violin stays as mezzo piano, but everything else goes all the way down to pianissimo, which is the quietest they've been yet, in order to provide the most contrast when it builds up to that first main melody. Because my goal with this first main melody is it is the loudest it's been. All of the chord notes are mezzo piano, which before they like would crescendo up there but then go back down, and then the melody is mezzo forte. This is the first time any instrument is playing mezzo forte, so this is the loudest point. However, I didn't want it to just immediately get super huge because that wouldn't really have developed enough. It would be a little it would feel a little abrupt, and I also wanted to leave room to grow bigger in the second half, which I'll show you, and if you've heard the song, you know what I'm talking about. So I needed to grow, but also leave room to continue to grow. And so the best way to do that is to get quieter beforehand so that there's more room to grow. So that's why this is the quietest point of the entire song. So you've got your minor one here, and then I kind of like the way I did this. I think it's interesting. The instruments that are just kind of holding out the chord play for the first 3 beats, and they're silent on the 4th. The violin, which is kind of providing a bit of the movement going into this, and the first violin, and is also going to play the main melody once it gets there. It plays for the first 2 beats, and then it's silent on the 3rd beat while the other 2 instruments play, or the other 4 instruments play, and they're sections, not instruments, because it's a full orchestra. But anyway, and then on the final beat, when everyone else is quiet, it's just the first violin, which provides that sort of that pickup into the next measure, which then gives you your major 6 chord, which you'll see a lot of in this next chord progression. And then it does the exact same thing where the first violin is quiet on the third beat, everything else is quiet on the fourth beat, and the first violin plays that note that then moves into the next beat. And then you've got, again, your major 6 chord, or just with a slightly different voicing because the top note has moved from this D to an A, which is actually the same note as the second violin. So it blends in a little bit, and it also adds even more power to that A. But then it moves up to this B, which is the sixth. So it brings in a bit of dissonance because that A and B are right by each other. Which actually, just so you can hear, just as an example of like what dissonance sounds like, here is what this A to B sounds like. Well, it would be more clear if this was louder. So I'm actually going to go ahead and make this mezzo piano just for a second so you can hear this. So you can hear how those two notes don't really work together. But they do. It's like, it sounds weird, but in a way that's cool. And not everyone likes dissonance, and especially if you're not as familiar with like music theory and things like that, that on its own might have sounded really weird to you. But when it's in the context of a full chord, it adds a really cool effect. And then this is, you've got your minor 1, add 4, which I believe this note is the 4th. And then it goes from a 4th to a 7th. And it builds up here from pianissimo up to piano. And then this all crescendos from piano to mezzo piano. And the first violin crescendos up to mezzo forte. So you finally hit this melody. And it is like this triumphant moment. It feels like an accomplishment because it took you a whole minute to get here. You were waiting so long in suspense for this melody. And when you finally get here, after having all basically the same chord progression the whole time, just with some varying like dissonant notes thrown in, just it's like the same progression just slightly adjusted every time. When you hit this melody, finally you have a completely new progression. Instead of starting on the minor 1 chord like it has done every single time, it starts on this major 4 chord. So you spend your whole time kind of in that minor world, which this is a very basic way of putting it and is not always true, but the most basic way to look at it is major chords sound happy and minor chords sound sad. Now, people who are very knowledgeable on music theory might freak out about me saying that, but on a basic level, that is one way of putting it. So because this always starts on the minor 1, you're kind of spending a lot of time in that minor world. It's built on this minor, this more sad feel. And then when you get here, it immediately hits you with a major chord. And so it feels happier, it feels lighter, and that causes it to feel so triumphant. It's like the beginning is whoever your her is. Maybe it's like before this relationship started, when you like the girl, but you don't know if she likes you back. You don't know what's going to happen, and then finally it ends, or not. Finally, that part of your life ends. And a new part begins because you find out she does like you or whatever. You start dating. I don't know. However you want to view it. But it's like it goes from this sadness, but not even necessarily sad. Just sort of pondering. That's a way to put it, I suppose. It goes from that into this how long have I been talking for? Half an hour. Oh my goodness. Okay. It goes from that into this triumphant, lighter feel. So it's like a big contrast, and it's louder, and you finally got your melody, and it's beautiful. So this chord progression, which basically just repeats the whole time, it's the major 4 to the minor 1, major 3, major 6, minor 1, major 3. Now, what is interesting to me is, like, there, anything with music theory is, which also I'm moving around a lot, so I don't know if I'm getting like quieter and louder depending on how far I am from the microphone, but whatever. But anything. Sorry, I just saw a text and I got distracted. Um, Anything with music theory is more of a guideline. You shouldn't be limited by music theory, but it is helpful to keep in mind. And one of the things that's kind of important with a chord progression is um, you want to try and start or end a chord progression with um, the one chord, because that is the actual key that you're based in, and it creates resolution, because since you're in that key kind of the whole time in the chord progression, it's wanting to resolve back to the root chord of that key. But what's interesting is if you look at this, at least the way that I have it written out, it starts with the 4 chord and it ends with the 3 chord, which means that it doesn't end by resolving to a 1, and when it repeats, it doesn't resolve to that 1. However, and I think I didn't fix this. I saw this as a 4. This should be a 6. However, now that I'm thinking about it, I would potentially make the argument that when we get here, if you look at this, major chord, major chord, major chord, major chord, the minor 1 chord is only for 1 beat every 2 measures. So I would make the argument that the 3 chord, this is A sharp major. Or sorry, not A sharp major. This is A major. And A major is the relative major of this key. So at the start of this video, when I said that this key, this 3 sharps, could either be A major or F sharp minor, that is called a relative minor and relative major. And so we started in F sharp minor. However, I would make the argument that when we get here, which means that I'm actually incorrect about, if I go with this interpretation, these are actually incorrect. But I would make the argument, now that I'm thinking about it, that I think when we get to this point, when the song gets here, it moves from F sharp minor to the relative major of A major, and it stays in A major for this whole section because it's pretty much entirely built on major chords. And you can see this would be the 1 chord in A sharp, sorry, I keep saying A sharp. This would be the 1 chord in A major, which means that you've got your 1 chord and it ends on the 1 chord, which is your goal in you want to try and start or end on the 1 chord in a chord progression. That also means that this 6 would actually be the 4. I'm going to try and show you what this would look like. So you would just move everything back 2, essentially. So this becomes minor 6. This would become a major 1. This would become the 4. This would become this again, and this would be that. So now if you look at this, I would say that we are now in A major. So you've got your 4, which is also called the subdominant. You've got your minor 6, your 1. And this is actually, these are some of the most common chord progressions in a major, most common chords in a major key. So when you're in a major key, the 3 most common chords are the 1 chord, which is called the tonic, the 4 chord, which is the subdominant, and the 5 chord, which is the dominant. All 3 of those chords are major. And so the 4 chord and the 1 chord fit very well together, and they transition between each other very easily. The 5 chord is the same, but it's even better. The 1 chord and the 5 chord fit together even better because the 5 chord is structured in a way where it wants to resolve to the 1 chord. I've heard it described before as it draws you to the 1 chord. And so a lot of the time, a chord progression will end with the 5 chord the 5 chord resolving to a 1 chord. That's a very common way to end a chord progression, and it is called an authentic cadence. And so I think here we've got that 1 chord, we've got that 4 chord, so it makes sense for major key. And then the fourth most common chord in a major key is this minor 6 chord. It's a way to add a different feel into the progression instead of all the chords being major when it's like the 1, the 4, and the 5. The 6 adds a different feel because it's minor, but it still fits within the key. It's not diminished like the 7 would be. And it's another common one. So this actually would make a lot of sense for a chord progression. And it means you're ending on the 1, which makes a lot of sense, and you're going from the 1 to the 4. I don't have this correct here now, but you're going from the 1 to the 4, and like I said, the 1 and the 4 fit together very well, so that would be a logical progression. So I'm going to go ahead and update these as well, so you can see this this idea some more. It's very simple. I just have to subtract 2. So like this is 6 and it becomes 4. This is 1, and if I go back 2, it's not going to be negative 1. But if I go back 2, then that goes 1, 7, 6. Thank goodness I didn't say that in the other order. You know what I mean? Also, just a little detail with this melody. These asterisks, I put an asterisk above each note that's not part of these chords. So that is, oh gosh, I forgot what the music theory term is for it, but there is a term. It's just like for any note that's outside of the key. It's like or outside of the chord. It's like a very straightforward name. It practically means like outside of chord note, from what I remember. But it's a common thing you'll notice in melodies is not every single note is going to be part of the chord. If every note is part of the chord, it's kind of boring. Like that's lame. And so with this, you see exactly that. And this is a common way of doing it, just kind of this stepwise motion where it's like it's just going up the scale. And the reason that this works really well is because it means that each of these notes outside the chord are sandwiched between notes that are in the chord. So this B is not part of the chord. It's going to sound a little weird, a little dissonant, and same with the D. But right before it is your A, which is in the chord. Right after it is the C sharp, which is in the chord. And then after the D, it goes back to C sharp, which is also in the next chord. So by sandwiching those notes, it sounds out of place for a moment, but then you immediately are grounded back in the chord in a way that adds some flavor to the song instead of feeling gross. So you've got a lot of examples of notes that are outside the chord. Also, something to keep in mind is it's not a bad thing to have like this stepwise motion like this where, you know, each note is one step apart, but you also want to try and make sure that it's not entirely like that, because then it's not as interesting of a melody. Like when I say you want to make sure not to do this or whatever, especially when it comes to melodies, they're just guidelines. There's a lot of different things you can do to make your melody more interesting, but you can do whatever you want. Like, it's your song, it's your melody. It's just, it might get a little boring if it's just going up and down by a step each note. So it, like, if you listen here, sometimes you don't necessarily do as big of jumps like this. But you know, I've got some bigger jumps in this melody, so I'm just gonna show you as an example. So it's all moving just up and down by a step, and then it has this big jump all the way down to a G. And then here you've got the same thing where it's this F sharp, and then it goes G sharp, F sharp, E. And so it's like all steps, and then there's a little jump down to this C sharp, and then it jumps all the way down to G sharp, and then way up to this B. And as with a lot of things in music, combining different, like, nothing is bad inherently. Like I said, to try not to just do stepwise motion, but that doesn't mean stepwise motion is bad. It's just you don't want to only do that. And it's the same with these big jumps. These big jumps make things more interesting, but if that's what you're doing the whole time, it's going to feel I've used this word a lot, but it's not going to feel very grounded. Like you can't really understand what's going on because you don't know where it's going to move to, essentially. Um, I can hear that my voice is starting to get a little weird because I've been talking for so long, but that's okay. Um, and so everything is good in moderation, and combining things together is a really powerful effect. So these bigger jumps work so well because the earlier parts set up an expectation that it's going to move in this stepwise motion, and then suddenly you're jumping. And this jump, it comes out of nowhere and it's completely unexpected, and so it catches you by surprise, it catches your attention. But then it goes back to being stepwise before the next big jump. So it catches your attention, but then it moves. It's just like when I talked about how, you got these notes that are like outside of the chord, but then they're only there temporarily. It's meant to catch your attention and be interesting, but then it goes back to what you're expecting and what you're used to quickly enough that it recontextualizes everything, and you're back to where you're used to. So then I really wanted to build up in the second half of this, and so I decided for the second portion of the first half, I decrescendoed down into it. And there's a bit more movement in the chords. You can see this: the first, third, and fourth measure are all the same chord, but it's bound to piano here, and then it starts to crescendo in the second half of this portion. But the second measure is different. Because I don't want to just completely repeat this melody because it'll get boring, especially because here it's the exact same melody, just an octave up. I want to sort of repeat the phrase but change up the melody a bit to keep it interesting. And so because I changed up the melody in the second measure, I also had to change up the chords to make it fit what I wrote for the melody. So you actually see right here, I talked about that 5 chord before and how that is one of the most common ones in a major key. If you look, you've got your 4 chord, which goes to a 5, 4, 1, 4, minor 6, and then a 1. Which, I just want to be clear, the minor 6 is in the key. So technically I should be saying major 4, major 5 if I'm going to specify it's a minor 6. But I just want to call out that one's minor because it's different. But like, again, looking at all these chords, this very logically looks like it's in a major key. Like, that actually makes more sense than the way I had it before. So you've got a similar melody. As you can see, this first measure is the same, but the second measure changes. But it still ends on this G, but then instead of the F sharp, it's an A, and then it goes upwards. Because whenever you are making whenever the next part is going to be up at like an octave, generally a good way to smoothly transition into that is to just have the measure before start moving up the octave, so that it starts working its way up there instead of just jumping way up right away. So that's like exactly what you've got going on here. You can see these asterisks. These are all the notes that don't fit in the chord, which generally speaking, it's like I said before, where they're sandwiched between things, and it's pretty quick. But there are a few exceptions. If you look at this G sharp, which, it was the same thing up here. But this G sharp is not in the chord, and it lingers for the entirety of this chord, which is 2 beats. It's half the measure. And then here, almost this entire measure of the melody line is not in the key. So that adds some interest, a little bit of spice to it. And then you get to the second half of the melody. Now the second half is the exact same with the exception of the first violins. The first violins are up an octave, which means they're playing the same notes, but it's higher. So if you listen to this, and now you listen here, it's the same notes, they're just an octave higher. It's also the loudest point of the song. The chords are mezzo forte and the melody is forte, and then it builds up into the melody being fortissimo and the chords being forte. So this is the very peak of the song. This is like the climax. So you've got your same chords, which I are incorrect, but I will update as I speak, and the same notes outside of the key. Like, everything is the same. One thing that I could have done is, because I was moving the melody line up an octave, I could have moved the chords up an octave, and that would have kind of fit in with like everything moving up. The thing is, I think part of what makes chords interesting is their contrast with the melody. So if you have the chords are all really low and the melody is also really low, the whole song is going to feel, low. And so that can be a really cool effect. That can be a great way to do it. But then if you have the exact same chords, the exact same melody, but you make the melody higher, you bring it up an octave or two, then you've got this really low, like heavy, muddy, like chords in the bottom, and then way up here is your melody, and it's like so much higher, and so it has a lighter feel, and so it provides that contrast of those low, heavy chords and this lighter melody, and it gives a completely different feel. And neither feel is better than the other, it's just different. And so that's exactly what's happening here. Is if you look at like this chord, it's okay if you can't read sheet music, but like this second violin part, which is in the chord, is playing this F sharp, and then the melody has this A, and they are very close together, these notes. So obviously, like, the bass is really low, but the chord as a whole is very close together, and it feels like it's all kind of in that same area. Whereas here, because that top note is now up an octave, it feels a lot lighter than the other notes. So you can hear, whereas that A in the first example blended in more, in the second example, it really stands out. And part of that is because now the melody is super loud, but also because it's so much higher. I'm going to play this one more time just so you can hear it again. That top note is like, it's really calling for your attention, whereas everything else still feels really low. And it almost feels like there's a wall between them. Like they're two separate groups of sound instead of blending as one thing. And it's a really cool effect. And so the reason I didn't move everything else up an octave is because that was the specific effect I was going for here. It's not that it would have been bad if I did do that, but it just wasn't what I envisioned. Now, something that I originally just tried because I was wanting to get this song done as quickly as possible, but then I ended up actually really liking how it sounded, is after this melody's done, the song ends by literally just repeating the entire intro exactly the same. Now, that could be seen as kind of lazy, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking that, but I actually think it's really cool for quite a few reasons. First of all, that intro is an F sharp minor. This melody, as I've discussed, I believe, is an A major. That means that when we go back here, we are essentially, we're moving back into a minor key. So we go from the major one chord of A major right into the minor one chord of F sharp minor. So it gives you that different feel. And what's really cool about that is it makes this part of the song feel completely different from the intro, at least in my opinion. Because when you start the song, you start with an F sharp major chord. So in your mind, it's F sharp major, and that's all you've known. So just it's like, okay, this is the intro, this is how it sounds. However, you then get to the melody and you get used to being in A major, the relative major of the exact same key. So it's not a big enough difference to get to like really stand out as like, oh, something's off here, because it's still in the same key. It's just now the relative major. So it sounds different and you get used to being in a major key. And then after this big triumphant moment where you've reached the loudest part of the song, you're up the octave and it's just like screaming at you like, oh, this her, she's beautiful or whatever. Then suddenly it gets quieter. And also you've got this four measure phrase, which is kind of what the whole song's built on. Is it's every four measures is a phrase, but now you've got this fifth measure thrown in just to spice things up. So then it's like, oh, what's going on? What's wrong? And it gets quiet, and then suddenly it's super quiet. You're back in a minor key, and so just with this extra measure thrown in, going from really loud to really quiet, and then going from a major key to the relative minor, it completely changes the context of the song at that point. And so it feels totally different than the beginning of the song because you're in this new context. You're not just in F sharp minor, you're in F sharp minor after being in A major. And so it's like a completely different, you've got that comparison, you've got that contrast instead of just F sharp minor is all you've ever known. And so I think that also could fit very well with the whole her idea, potentially, depending on the way you want to look at it. But yeah, I think it's really cool, and that's why I'm actually really happy with the way that turned out. But this is, as I said, exactly the same. So all the stuff I said at the beginning applies. And the one exception, and this is what I think is really, really cool, is I'm really happy. I mean, there's some other things that are really cool, but I'm really happy with the way I ended this because this is, you get to the end of the intro part, and this is normally where it would build into the melody. This is where it built into the melody last time, is what I mean. Whereas here, instead, it's decrescendoing into the final chord. But what's really cool about this is because we're in F sharp minor, generally speaking, you want to end a chord, and not a chord, you want to end a song with the one chord, with the tonic chord. Because that is like the context of the song, and every chord progression essentially is wanting to, as I mentioned before, it wants to, pretty much the whole time, you want to resolve back to the one chord. So by ending the whole song on the one chord, it gives the song as a whole a feeling of resolution. It feels like you've reached the end. However, since this is in F sharp minor, the way, if I were to do that, then I would be ending on an F sharp minor chord, which would leave the song on a negative note. Because like I said, which negative note is not a music theory term, I mean, like, it would end it off at a sad point. Because like I said before, generally speaking, minor chords sound sad, major chords sound happy. So if I ended on the F sharp minor chord, like would be logical for this section, the song will end off sad. But that's not what I wanted, because this song is generally meant to be more of a, just like, the idea is an appreciation for whoever this her is. And so it's not meant to be sad. There's some sort of a bittersweet feeling in the beginning, which I think is a word I was looking for earlier and couldn't think of. But there's a bit of a bittersweet feeling in the beginning and the ending. But overall, it's just supposed to be like this happy, like beautiful appreciation for this person. So I didn't want to end it off on a sad note. So what I did is I ended it off on the major 3 chord in F sharp minor, which is A major. So even though this whole last bit is in F sharp minor, I end the chord with the relative major chord that we were in for this melody. So even though it's kind of in the minor key, it's feeling sad, at the very end, the final chord moves back into our relative major to end things on a happy note. And I think that's really cool. And I wrote out all this stuff to explain the song, and I was ready, but I didn't even realize like how cool some of this stuff was until I explained it. I'm like actually really happy with this song and the way it's built and the way I'm actually very happy with the way I explained it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it and appreciated it. And if anyone actually watched all the way through this hour long of me talking about like a 3-minute song or whatever that I wrote in an hour, like this explanation literally took the amount of time it took me to write this song. And that's what I think is really interesting, is when you know music theory, you can just do stuff so quickly. Like, I just wrote stuff, and a lot of this stuff that I talked about, like especially, you know, the going from F sharp minor to the relative major, A major for the melody, the main melody part, like that kind of thing. I didn't think about that as I was writing it. I just heard how it should sound in my head, and I wrote it down. And then that was what ended up happening. And so there's so much cool music theory stuff that goes on, especially when you know a lot about music theory going into writing the song, but you're not even necessarily consciously thinking about it. And so then to go through and analyze exactly what you did is actually really cool and interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned some. And if you haven't heard this song yet, you should totally go listen to it, because I really like it. It's one of my favorite I've written. I think it really fits the movie soundtrack vibe, which is a big thing that I've been especially interested in recently. But I've kind of my whole music composition career, I've always been into writing stuff inspired by it. I've in the past described my style of composition as 50% music, not sorry, 50% music, 50% classical music, and 50% soundtrack. So yeah, thank you for watching. I will probably do more of these in the future. I don't know, but I honestly am so happy with how this one went that I don't even know when I'll do the next one, because I feel like there's no way it can be as good as this one, especially because I explained so much like specific music theory things that I might not end up explaining all of it again in the next one. And so this might be like the best one of the series, but I think it would be, if I make more, they'll still be worth watching. So I'm planning to do more in the future, so you can check those out. You can subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified whenever I end up making those. They probably won't be as long as this, but no promises. And I've got some other ideas for songs that I'll probably write at some point, and there should hopefully be exciting stuff on the way sometime soon. I've got some big projects planned. I just don't know when I'm going to start them or how long they'll take. So anyway, for like the third time in the past 2 minutes, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a lot, and goodbye.